Why America chose the atomic bomb. The truth behind Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The decision by the United States to use nuclear weapons on Japan at the end of World War II remains one of the most controversial events in modern history. To understand why America took such a drastic step, we need to look at the context, the motivations, and the reasoning behind the use of these deadly bombs. It wasn't just a random decision or a desire for power, but a culmination of years of war, strategic considerations, and the complex reality of what it would take to end a devastating global conflict. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not just military operations, they were symbolic acts that marked the beginning of a new chapter in warfare and global politics. The roots of the decision to use nuclear weapons on Japan can be traced back to the earlier years of World War II, when the United States and its allies were drawn into the war following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. This attack was a turning point for the United States, pushing the country into full-scale involvement in both the Pacific and European theaters of war. Over the next several years, the US and Japan would become bitter enemies, with battles taking place across vast stretches of the Pacific Ocean and various islands. The fighting was brutal and unforgiving, with both sides suffering tremendous losses. By 1945, however, the war in Europe had largely ended, but the war in the Pacific was far from over. Japan, despite suffering significant losses and being increasingly cornered by a combination of Allied naval blockades, bombings, and the strategic island-hopping campaign, refused to surrender. The Japanese leadership was determined to fight until the bitter end, often willing to sacrifice huge numbers of soldiers and civilians to achieve their goal of defending their homeland. This no-surrender mentality was rooted in both cultural and military ideology, particularly the concept of honor and the belief that Japan's national spirit could not be broken. The United States, on the other hand, had been preparing for a final push to bring the war to an end. American military leaders had begun to make plans for an invasion of the Japanese home islands, codenamed Operation Downfall. This invasion would have involved hundreds of thousands of American troops and would have resulted in a prolonged and bloody campaign. The war had already taken a heavy toll on both sides, and American leaders were aware that such an invasion could cost even more lives, not only American lives, but also Japanese lives. Some military planners estimated that the invasion could result in hundreds of thousands of American casualties, as well as millions of Japanese casualties, as civilians were expected to be involved in the defense. At the same time, the United States was working on a secret project called the Manhattan Project, which aimed to develop a new kind of weapon that could potentially change the course of the war. The project was launched in response to fears that Nazi Germany might develop nuclear weapons first. But as the war in Europe was winding down, American scientists were making significant progress, and by July 1945, the first successful test of an atomic bomb was conducted in the New Mexico desert. This was the beginning of a new era in warfare, one in which the sheer destructive power of a single weapon could alter the course of history. The atomic bomb was unlike any weapon ever used before. It had the potential to kill tens of thousands of people instantly and leave lasting environmental and genetic damage. Its destructive power was so immense that its use would not only bring an immediate end to the war, but also send a powerful message to the world, particularly to the Soviet Union, which was emerging as a rival superpower. By the time the United States had developed the atomic bomb, the balance of power in the post-war world was shifting, and the bomb represented a new kind of leverage that could shape the global order. Despite the fact that the United States now had a powerful new weapon at its disposal, the decision to use the atomic bomb on Japan was not taken lightly. President Harry S. Truman, who had taken office after the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt in April 1945, was faced with an extremely difficult decision. Truman and his advisors were fully aware of the devastating potential of the bomb, and they knew that using it would have profound moral and political consequences. Yet, the primary consideration for Truman was the end of the war and the saving of lives. The United States had already been engaged in a campaign of conventional bombing over Japan, and the results had been catastrophic. Cities like Tokyo had been reduced to rubble, with tens of thousands of civilians killed in air raids. The Japanese military had refused to surrender, and there seemed to be no other way to force Japan's leaders to capitulate. As the American military leadership weighed its options, a number of factors came into play. One of the most pressing was the desire to avoid a bloody invasion of Japan. The United States was determined to bring the war to an end as quickly as possible, but they also had to consider the larger strategic implications. A prolonged war would only delay the peace process and potentially give Japan more time to regroup and strengthen its defenses. The atomic bomb was seen as a way to force Japan's surrender without the need for an invasion. It was a way to break the deadlock and bring an immediate end to the war. Another factor that influenced the decision was the desire to assert American dominance in the post-war world. The atomic bomb was not just a weapon, it was a symbol of the United States' technological and military power. It was a message to both Japan and the Soviet Union that the United States now held a decisive advantage in terms of military capability. The use of the bomb was not just a tactical military move, it was a geopolitical statement. The US wanted to make it clear that it was the dominant global power and that it would shape the future world order. There were also practical concerns about Japan's willingness to surrender. While Japan's military was clearly in a weakened state, its leadership still believed that they could negotiate a more favorable peace settlement. The Japanese government had sent peace feelers through the Soviet Union, hoping to broker a deal with the Allies, but these efforts were rejected. Japan's military leaders were still determined to fight, and they believed that they could resist the Allies long enough to force a negotiated peace. However, their position was untenable, and the United States was not interested in negotiating terms. It was focused on securing an unconditional surrender. In the months leading up to the bombings, the United States had already been taking steps to isolate Japan and weaken its resolve. The naval blockade had cut off Japan's access to vital resources, and the bombing campaign had destroyed much of its industrial capacity. But still, Japan refused to surrender. The United States needed a decisive action to break the stalemate, and the atomic bomb offered a potential solution. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped the first atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. The bomb, known as Little Boy, was a uranium-based weapon that unleashed an explosion equivalent to approximately 15,000 tons of TNT. The immediate effects were catastrophic. Thousands of people were killed instantly, and many others were severely injured or later died from radiation sickness. The city was destroyed, and the Japanese government was forced to confront the reality of the weapon's power. Despite the immense destruction, Japan still did not immediately surrender. Just 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, the United States dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. This bomb, known as Fat Man, was a plutonium-based weapon and caused similar devastation. Once again, thousands of people were killed, and the city was obliterated. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not just military actions, they were shockwaves that reverberated throughout the world, signaling the dawn of a new age in warfare. In the days following the bombings, Japan's leadership began to reconsider its position. The devastation wrought by the bombs, combined with the Soviet Union's declaration of war against Japan on August 8, finally convinced Japan's emperor, Hirohito, that surrender was the only option. On August 15, 1945, Japan announced its unconditional surrender, effectively bringing an end to World War II. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not without their critics, both at the time and in the years since. Many people, both in the United States and around the world, questioned whether the bombings were truly necessary to end the war. Some argued that Japan was already on the verge of surrender, and that the use of atomic weapons was an unnecessary and inhumane act. Others believed that the bombings were a message to the Soviet Union, signaling the United States' dominance in the post-war world. However, at the time, the prevailing view among American leaders was that the bombings had been a necessary evil. The United States had no desire to drag the war out any longer. and the bombings were seen as a way to end the conflict quickly and decisively. The fact that the bombings succeeded in forcing Japan's surrender within days was viewed by many as proof of their effectiveness. The legacy of the atomic bombings is still a topic of debate today. For some, the bombings represent a tragic but necessary step to end the war and save lives. For others, they symbolize the horrors of nuclear weapons and the terrible consequences of using such powerful instruments of destruction. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki ushered in the nuclear age, and the world would never be the same again. In the years following the war, the use of nuclear weapons became a central issue in global politics. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union was largely defined by the threat of nuclear war, and the existence of these weapons fundamentally changed the way nations interacted with each other. The atomic bombings of Japan, while effectively ending World War II, also marked the beginning of a new era in which the threat of annihilation through nuclear warfare would hang over humanity. In the end, the decision to use nuclear weapons on Japan was driven by a combination of military strategy. If you found this video of history insightful, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more explorations into the events that shaped our world. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more thought-provoking content.